Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Network Seminar Series hosted by the Center for Networked Intelligence at the ECE and RBCCPS IISc. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Max Pfeffer. He will be speaking on manifold optimization in data science. Dr. Max is a junior professor of mathematics in the Georg-August-Universität of Göttingen since April 2023. Prior to this, he held research and academic positions at Simulamed Oslo, Technische Universität Chemnitz and Johannes Gutenberg University at Leipzig and Max Planck Institute for Mathematics in the Sciences in Leipzig. He completed his PhD in mathematics at TU Berlin in 2018, where he also earned his MSc and BSc degrees. His research interest is in tensors, Riemannian optimization and applications. Over to you, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and, of course, for the kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here at IISc, at this famous university or institute. And yes, today I will talk about manifold optimization in data science. So I will give a very easy introduction into manifold optimization and into all of the stuff that I will be doing here. So no worries. Let's start. Oh, no, this doesn't work. Oh, I know why. Okay. The main thing that we start with is matrix factorizations. I think probably most of you have seen matrix factorizations, yeah? And why do we do matrix factorizations in data science? We have several reasons for that. One is dimensionality reduction. So you want to decompose your matrix into smaller parts, and then you just have fewer degrees of freedom, right? This is one of the things that you want to do. The other is feature extraction. So you've seen this in recommender systems. You decompose a matrix into these small low-rank parts, and then you see that there are shared features across different samples, and then you can learn from these features. You can interpret them, for example, right? This is, for example, done in the famous principal component analysis, right, which probably most of you have heard about. And then we can use actually matrix factorizations also for clustering. So sometimes we can just reduce the dimensionality and then do k-means clustering or something like this, but we can also learn from the matrix factorization in terms of feature extraction and then do clustering and so on. So this is basically a subset of unsupervised learning, okay? So really what we're doing is here we get a data set and we want to do some unsupervised learning with it. Find patterns, do clustering, something like this, okay? This is the basics. So what do I mean when I talk about matrix factorizations? Let's have a matrix M of size m by n. Then we decompose it into two matrices, X and Y. So X is now a matrix of size m by r, and Y is a matrix of size n by r. In this case, r is smaller than both n or n. And then we have here a tall matrix and here a fat matrix, right? And then you multiply them together, and you see that the degrees of freedoms have reduced. We have fewer degrees of freedom than before. Okay, this is the most basic form. Of course, we can introduce some matrices in the middle, if you like. Yeah, we can have as many layers in between as we want. These can be called hidden layers. And then if we have a few of them here, the smallest of these Ri would be the rank of the matrix M ultimately. Okay. And we can do this obviously not only, we can also do this in order to approximate M. That's something that we often do in data science, right? Okay, so some examples for matrix factorizations. The examples that you all know, for a symmetric matrix M, for example, we can look at the Cholesky decomposition, where we can find a lower triangular matrix that you can multiply with itself transposed. And then this is the Cholesky decomposition that you need in many, many algorithms, right, to make them more efficient. Then we can look at the QR decomposition. Here we have the matrix M decomposed as Q times R, where R is an upper triangular matrix and Q is an orthogonal matrix, like this, yeah? This is also very, very useful in many applications. You probably all have algorithms where we use the QR decomposition, right? One of the decompositions that is the most used by me, so that is kind of the workhorse for my research, is the singular value decomposition. Also that one you have seen a lot probably. It's kind of a generalization of an eigenvalue decomposition for matrices of any size. And here we have that M is decomposed into three matrices. the first U is an orthogonal or left orthogonal matrix, and the V is a right orthogonal matrix, or like also left orthogonal, but then you transpose it, right? And then in the middle we have a diagonal matrix that contains the singular values, and they should be non-negative, and some of them might be 0, and then they can also give us the rank of the matrix, right? So a very powerful tool in numerical linear algebra, the singular value decomposition. And then we can look at something that I've shown you at the beginning already. So let's see that we just basically take our matrix and decompose it into many parts somehow, into a row of them. We can call this a linear neural network. This is something that people do mostly for theoretical research, right? Nowadays, people look at linear neural networks in order to understand gradient flows of stochastic gradient method and so on, in order to somehow study machine learning, because linear neural networks, while they seem a little bit trivial, they are the simplest case of neural networks, if you want. Yeah. Okay. Now, what I do is not only matrix factorization, but I also look at tensors. And tensors, when I say tensor, so you might know this sometimes differently. If you go to differential geometry, then tensors can have a different meaning. What I mean is simply that a tensor is a matrix that has more than 2 modes, right? So I have an array that has d modes, and then it's just a d-dimensional or an order d array, if you like. And tensors can also be factorized, and we have different formats for those factorizations as well. And some of you might know some of these factorizations. The historical, the oldest one, but also one of the most famous ones, is the canonical polyadic decomposition, or basically some people just call it tensor rank decomposition. Here you can understand this basically as some kind of multilinear analogon of the singular value decomposition, right? So we basically decompose the tensor T into a sum of tensors that have rank 1. And rank 1 means that they are outer products of vectors, right? Or tensor products of vectors. So each, for a tensor of order 3 that I can depict like a cube here, we can draw this just as an outer product of 3 vectors, and then we sum over those, okay? And then the minimal number of terms that you need for this is the tensor rank. So you might have heard of that. The nice thing about this is that usually if I give you a tensor and you want to compute the CP decomposition, you will get a unique solution. Yeah. So if you compute it with a random starting point and you do some numerical algorithm, you will always get the same solution. I mean, okay, so unique up to certain. I mean, you can definitely reorder and you can scale. This is clear, yeah. We can somehow put this in here. So if the vectors should be normalized and you have a factor in front here, and then you say that somehow the ordering doesn't matter, then it's unique, okay? But yeah, you're right. You will usually get a unique solution, not always. Yeah, this is a difficult problem. And a nice thing about this is that you can also easily interpret them. So you can see this as some kind of generalization of the PCA for tensors, right? We basically get vectors, and each vector can be called a feature vector, and then these are the main components in your data, right? So this for data science, this is very nice. So this is how we do it. The thing about the tensor decomposition here is that these vectors U, they are not usually orthogonal, okay? So you don't impose orthogonality here. You have to do that in singular value decomposition to make it unique. In this case, you don't do that because then it's too restrictive, okay? It's already unique if you don't give orthogonality as a constraint, and usually those vectors will not be orthogonal, okay? Or those matrices, if you put these vectors into a matrix, it's not going to be a left orthogonal matrix. The bad thing about this decomposition is that it's quite difficult to compute. It has a lot of numerical challenges. One of them is that the space of tensors with fixed rank is not closed, and it's not a manifold or a variety or something like this. So it's very complicated for algorithmic computations, okay? And this is one reason why many people don't use it. Another format is the Tucker decomposition. Here we basically have still a tensor core, and then you find a subspace that the tensor lies in each mode, okay? So for each mode, you do a matricization, you find a subspace, and then these vectors here, or these matrices here, span the subspaces, and then you have like some subspaces in each direction. So in a certain way, this is also a generalization of the singular value decomposition, just in a kind of different way, okay? So the nice thing about this one is that it's quite easy to compute. We basically... sorry, this means, okay, yeah, this means that it's the mode 1 matrix multiplication. So you multiply a matrix into the first mode, and then this you multiply a matrix into the second mode, and so on. So kind of what this depicts here, right? Yeah, so you have matrices of size ni times ri, and then you have a tensor core of sizes r1 up to rd, okay? And then you multiply this in each mode. The nice thing about this is that it's easy to compute, because all we need to do is we need to take a matricization of our data. We compute the singular value decomposition. I will get to this, and we can do this over and over again in different modes. The bad thing, so it's also okay because we can make it unique, so that you can somehow interpret your features. So if you want, these can be the features here, the leaves, or like the outer matrices, and you can you can interpret the subspaces that you get here, right? But the bad thing about this decomposition is that somehow it's still exponential in D, right? We still have a tensor core, so we didn't really compress the data very much. And especially if you have low Ni here, if Ni in many applications, Ni is just 2, and then you can't really use this, right? Because you can't really compress it in this direction. But 2 to the power 100 is still a very large tensor, but you can't really help it with the Tucker decomposition. Okay, I will talk a little bit about some other decompositions. So the tensor train decomposition is one that I worked on a lot in my research. So this comes up in parametric PDEs, but also in quantum chemistry. So often the wave functions in quantum chemistry are given by tensor trains. And here, yeah, I introduced another notation here. Basically, what this means is that you have a matrix here and a matrix here, and in between you have a tensor of order 3. And this means that you always, you multiply together the last mode of this and the first mode of that. Okay, and then you just kind of multiply them together. This is why it looks like a train in the end. Okay, for a tensor of order 3, then there should only be 3 components. But for a larger tensor, it will be a train like this. Okay. So this is a useful decomposition, not so much in data science, but it's useful because it has better storage than Tucker. Now we scale again linear in the order D, and it's also easy to compute. We can also make it unique. So we can find the unique if we impose some extra constraints. But the bad thing is that here we don't really know how to interpret. Okay, we don't really use it much in data science because these tensors here, they cannot be easily interpreted. So that's a problem. Okay. And you can go even more general. So in the end, you can kind of do whatever kind of order of unfolding that you like, and then decompose, and then you get the so-called tree tensor networks, and they can have any tree structure that you like, as long as it's a tree and it doesn't have any cycles. It basically maintains all of the nice features of the tensor train or Tucker decomposition. Okay. Once you have a cycle, it becomes very complicated mathematically, and we again have the problem that it's not a closed space and so on. Yeah. But for tensor trees in general, you have very nice properties. The main difficulty with tensor trees is that it's a pain to implement them in computers, right? Because you have so many indices and multiplications and so on. Okay. So far about tensor factorizations. Are there any questions? What I also do, or what I look at, are so-called joint factorizations. And here, the idea is that you have several data sets. So let's say we have a collection of matrices M1 up to Mk, and maybe we also have some tensor data, T1 up to TL. And some of the modes coincide, okay? So we want to decompose these with some shared factors. We want to basically say that the data, they should share, like the decomposition should share some factors. So one example here would be that I have a matrix M and I have a tensor T, and the first mode coincides. So what you can imagine is that basically the first mode is the sample mode. You have, let's say, 2,000 samples, and for the matrix data, you just have for each sample you have a vector, and for the tensor data, for each sample you have a tensor. Okay, but the first mode corresponds to the same samples. Okay, And then the idea is that you maybe do some matrix factorization x times y transpose for m, and a tensor factorization that is the canonical tensor factorization. But what you want is that the column vectors xi here are also the column vectors of this matrix X. Okay? So this is a joint factorization. And you do this in order to somehow take data for the same, so you have for the same samples, you have different measurements, and you want to somehow bring them together, right? And this is done in biology, and I will give an example later for this, okay? So this is then called joint factorizations. And next, what is often done, and we have seen this already, is that we impose constraints on the factors, okay? Very often, it is beneficial to impose constraints. Like in the singular value decomposition, we have the orthogonality constraint, we have the diagonality constraint, we have seen the constraints of upper triangularity in the QR decomposition, and so on, right? So these are all constraints that we can impose on the factors. So some examples are, as I said, orthogonality. This can enforce uniqueness, so we impose it when we want to make this more unique, or when we want to find a unique solution. Also, it gives us a form of independence of the columns, right? It's linear. They are linearly independent. They are even orthogonal, so that's nice. Then we can have column normalization. So that kind of gives us, again, some kind of restriction on the norm, but it doesn't give us independence, right? So the columns should be normalized, but they don't need to be independent. So this is less of a restriction than orthogonality, but it still is a bit more of a restriction than doing nothing, okay? Also, maybe for interpretation, it's nice if the columns are the same norm, right? This is also something that you would like. Often we have non-negativity as a constraint, okay? So the factors should be non-negative. Usually you impose this when the data itself is non-negative, right? So when we have measurements that is non-negative measurements, we would also do a non-negative matrix factorization. Then we can impose sparsity. So we would like to have that many of the entries of the factors are 0. This is especially useful if we want to do feature extraction, right? If you look at the feature vectors and you want to see which features are the most important, or which predictors are the most important, then you can do sparsity here. And we will see also an application about signal processing, which maybe for you is the most interesting, where we do this. And I have also looked a little bit into this, but it's a way too complicated problem. So you can do Boolean decompositions, where the matrix factors should have only zeros and ones. But not only that, you could also say that the matrix product should be done in the max times algebra, which is the Boolean algebra, right? So this means that instead of doing plus, you do max, right? Because if you have like a truth value in one form and you have it at the same point a truth value, if you put them together, you don't want them to be 2. You want them to be still true, right? So this is the max times algebra. And the matrix factorization in max times algebra, this is a very complicated problem. So you do this for truth values, but it's NP hard, and I don't know. It's interesting, but very complicated, okay? And then we can, for example, also impose statistical independence of the columns or something like this, and many other constraints like upper triangularity and stuff like this, right? Okay. So next we can address some theoretical problems that come with these matrix and tensor factorizations. The first is always, can I compute it? Yeah, is it possible do I have an algorithm that gives me the best solution, or at least some quasi-best solution? Can I approximate this nicely? For example, for the Boolean decomposition, there is an algorithm, but it's NP hard. It's shown that you can do some kind of heuristic, but it doesn't work very well. But for the singular value decomposition, we know that there is a very efficient algorithm, and so on, right? Next, we can study uniqueness. We have discussed this already. If I give you a certain format and I give you a data set, will you always get the same result back, right? This is a uniqueness question, and it's very important for data science. Then we can consider this closeness problem. Like I give you a data set and I give you a format, and will the set of data that can be represented in this format, is this a closed set? Because if it's not, then it's very difficult to compute again. So this is related to the first point, right?
Can't you just make your constraint a closed set? Or even if you, for example, in the previous slide you mentioned many constraints. So will none of those constraints give you closeness? For example, like set of all.
Yes, I mean, I guess in a certain way you can impose that maybe, but so you could for example try to have it normalized always and stuff like this, right? So that you have it intersected with a sphere. But if you look at this CP decomposition, even if you intersect it with the sphere, it will not be closed, right? So it's a very useful format, but it will not be closed. So I don't think that you can always claim that. Maybe you can try to I mean, that's one of the things that if you want to do modeling and you want to come up with a new format, one of the things you have to consider is, will it be a closed set? And you will try to reach that, of course. And yeah, I guess you should impose constraints that result in a unique and closed format, right? That's the idea. But it's ideal, but it's not always possible, I guess. Something that more the pure mathematician study is the constrained rank. Yeah. So let's say I give you a decomposition or a format, and I tell you that there is a constraint on the format. What is the rank with this? For example, in non-negativity, right? I can give you a non-negative matrix, and you can easily compute the rank of the non-negative matrix using the singular value decomposition. But finding the rank of the non-negative matrix, but finding the non-negative rank, so that the matrix is decomposed in two non-negative matrices, that's not always the same, right? It's very obvious that it's at least as big as the rank, because the rank is the one that has no constraints. But what the actual non-negative rank is NP hard. Okay, so in many of these constraints to understand the rank of the unfolding or of the factorization is also a very difficult theoretical problem. I don't usually look at these, but it's something that people do. Yeah. Okay, but more importantly for us now, how do we solve? Okay, so to the point of computability, I want to introduce algorithms, and how do we compute these factorizations? So some examples are known. For example, the LU decomposition that you all know, I guess, the LU decomposition can be computed using the Gauss algorithm. Everyone knows that, right? The QR decomposition can be computed using householder transformations. You've maybe learned that in a numerical, like in numerics lecture, yeah? How this is done. The singular value decomposition can be basically computed using QR decompositions and the QR algorithm, and then you can solve it at least to arbitrary accuracy in polynomial time. Okay, so if I give you an epsilon, you will find in polynomial time a singular value decomposition that is at least as close to the actual solution as this. But otherwise, for other formats, we need some optimization algorithms. And the general form of these optimization algorithms is of the following. We have to minimize such a function here. So usually I take the Frobenius norm. You can also do different measurements here, right? You can also do the Kullback-Leibler divergence if you like. This is what people do for counting values and something like this. But yeah, this is the idea. And the way that I've written it now, it's already a non-convex optimization problem, right? Because we have two factors here, and this is already quite difficult. And then you have to do this for each matrix and tensor. So if you want to do several at the same time, you introduce more. Then this kind of gives you the format of the decomposition, right? Just writing it here. You can impose extra constraints by constraining these to be in a subset, right? So this S could be a subset of the whole space. You can also have a penalty parameter, right? And then you can do penalty function on X and Y or both, whatever you like. And then, as I said, if you want to do joint factorizations, you can have the first matrix here, the second matrix here, and then in this case that I've written, the X factor is the same, the Y factor could be different, okay? But you can obviously do it any way you like. And this is just the optimization problem. So now we need to solve it, right? Sorry, again?
You said instead of norm, you can do K divergence. How do you do that?
I mean, you just impose here a different function, and then you have to do, if you want to do gradient descent, you would do it with respect to that, right? Yeah. But you can put any, I mean, it doesn't have to be a norm, right? It could be any kind of distance function that you like. Okay. So some techniques for doing this now. Some factorizations, again, can be solved using maybe successive QR or SVD decompositions, right? So for example, the Tucker format I already showed you. Here you can basically take the first unfolding and do the QR decomposition of that, and then you get the first, this is the Q matrix basically here, yeah? And this is the remaining part, and then you do an unfolding of that, and then you get another part, and then you continue and so on, like, yeah? So this is the algorithm, how people compute the Tucker factorization. You don't really need optimization algorithms or gradient descent for that, okay? One of the most widely used algorithms for these kind of problems is the so-called alternating least squares algorithm. And that algorithm is very simple, and it's kind of the first idea that you would have when you come to this kind of problem. Namely, you take your optimization problem, you fix one of your factors. In this case, we fixed the y, and then we minimize for x. And if I minimize this thing for x, it's a linear problem, so it's a least squares problem. It's very easy to solve, okay? So no problem here. But now I need to fix x and minimize for y, and then I need to repeat, because I will not, one step is not enough, right? I have to do this over and over again. So this is a very kind of easy to implement algorithm. And the nice thing is that we will get decreasing cost function. It will get much better over time. But the problem is that we cannot guarantee convergence to, not even to critical points, okay? So this can go wrong. We can somehow get stuck. And also it can be quite slow. Yeah, this is a problem. But still, I would say, if you have such a problem, the first thing you should do is always implement ALS and see if it solves it, okay? It's very easy. It's just a least squares solution, so there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, but if we don't want to do that, we can do all-at-once optimization. And what I mean by that is that we take all factors at the same time and minimize over all of them, right? This becomes a non-convex problem, as I already said. This is, for example, done in TensorLab. So here in TensorLab, this is a tensor toolbox where you can compute these kind of formats, and they use the Gauss-Newton method for many of the optimization problems and stuff like this. Okay, so this is what you can do. And if you don't do the Gauss-Newton method, now we get to the part that is in my title. You can do Riemannian optimization. Okay, and Riemannian optimization I will now give a short introduction into. Okay, so what happens if one of the factors or all of the factors are constrained to a Riemannian manifold? So does everyone know what a manifold is? You can say no. Then I will explain very briefly. So maybe I can do this on the blackboard or whiteboard. A manifold is basically a curved space that looks, if you take a point, it looks in some kind of surrounding, it looks locally like the Euclidean space, okay? So it's only slightly curved, so you can somehow uncurve it. You can find these charts, and then you can find a different chart for a different point, and all you need to make sure is that they somehow connect to each other, right, in the right way, okay? So this means that a Riemannian manifold looks locally like Euclidean space, and this means that locally we can approximate it by a linear space, which is called the tangent space, yeah? And all of the tangent spaces together kind of approximate the manifold. And what you want from a Riemannian manifold is that the tangent spaces have the same dimension in each point, right? So they cannot drop dimensions. So what cannot happen, for example, is if you have something like this, right? At each point, it's two-dimensional, and here in the middle, you have this crossing of tangent spaces, and this is not good then, okay? So usually, a Riemannian manifold has to look locally like a Euclidean space with always the same dimension, okay? And you can imagine that once you have such a manifold, you can actually somehow perform the same algorithms that you can in Euclidean space. You just have to make sure that you keep this curvature in mind, right? But everything else remains somehow the same. And this is what happens in Riemannian optimization. So here I have a function, f, and I want to minimize it for x in some subset, and S is now a Riemannian manifold, okay? The subset. So what do I do? Like, let's, for example, say here I have f of x is, again, this function that I've showed you, like this cost function, but x could now be constrained to the Riemannian manifold of left orthogonal matrices, okay? I will get to this, but if you have a manifold where all the columns are orthogonal, if you have a matrix where all the columns are orthogonal, this gives you a Riemannian manifold, okay? And this is a curved space that you can work on. So it looks something like this. I don't know, this is just kind of a picture. And what we do now is we start in some point xk. So I want to do gradient descent, right? The algorithm that you probably all know. So I start in some point xk. Then I compute the Riemannian gradient. And the Riemannian gradient has to be in the tangent space. Okay, so basically you compute the gradient, you project it on the tangent space, as long as you are embedded. But this is a different problem. So let's say the gradient is on the tangent space, and then you have a direction, right? So the next step is you find an appropriate step size. That's what you always have to do in gradient descent, right? You have to know how far do I want to go to ensure convergence. And then I project it back down, or I bring it back down to the manifold. And this is called a retraction step. So usually you can do some differential geometry here. You can basically find a curve that gives you the shortest path on the manifold in this direction. This is called a geodesic. But you can also find some approximation of that, okay? So as long as you somehow get back to the manifold and it follows a certain set of assumptions, you are fine, okay? So this is relatively simple. And then I am at the new step and I continue, okay? So this is the idea of Riemannian optimization. It's a very simple algorithm. It's just the generalization of gradient descent to Riemannian manifolds. And we can do basically all kinds of improvements to this algorithm that are also possible in Euclidean space. You can do Newton method on Riemannian manifolds as well. But then you need to have access to the second derivative on Riemannian manifolds, so you need Riemannian connections, and the differential geometry becomes a bit more complicated. You can do BFGS method, for example, but for the BFGS method, you have to, so I don't know if you know the BFGS method, but you have a vector, and then you kind of correct your vector, your gradient with the old search direction, right? But in this case, the old search direction lives in a different tangent space than the new search direction. So you have to transport them along the path so that they live in the new tangent space. So you have to make some things, right? Some things you have to make sure, but it does work, and it's a nice theory. I will not go much more into detail here. What I will tell you is that some examples for smooth manifolds, and these are the ones that I work on. There are obviously a lot more. But the ones that I work on are clearly matrix manifolds, right? I have matrices, I have factors, so usually I look at matrix manifolds. And there are quite a few of them. So these can be derived using Lie algebra, if you've heard of that. So the first one, and one of the most widely used ones, is the Stiefel manifold, okay? The Stiefel manifold is exactly what I showed you. It's the set of matrices that has orthonormal columns, okay? So this means that X transpose X is the identity, but it doesn't mean that it's not the orthogonal group, right? Because we have only R columns, right? So we have fewer columns than we have rows. So this is why this is the Stiefel manifold. We can look at this oblique manifold. The oblique manifold is basically just the product of spheres. So this is the manifold of matrices that have normalized columns, right? So they don't need to be orthogonal to each other, but they all need to be normalized. And then you just have a product of spheres. And then we look at the fixed rank manifold. So this is one that I also work with a lot. So you can basically look at the matrix X, and you can say the matrix X, all matrices that have rank exactly R. This again gives you a manifold. And for all of these manifolds, we do have access to tangent spaces, to projections, to retractions, to geodesics sometimes, and so on. So we know how they look like. There are closed form solutions for most of them, and we can basically perform these algorithms on these manifolds, okay? We can take products of all of these, and all of this is implemented in a toolbox that is called ManOpt. So I urge you to have a look at it. It's quite nice. You can do some nice computations with ManOpt. ManOpt has been done by Nicolas Boumal, who is now in Lausanne, professor in Lausanne. And he had a colleague who's, unfortunately, he quit academia, but he works now for Microsoft in Hyderabad. That's the person I wanted to meet. Bamdev Mishra, he's now in Hyderabad, but he worked on this ManOpt toolbox as well. And there is also a version in Python. Most of you might use Python more than MATLAB. And there is also now a version in Julia, which is, in my opinion, a very nice language. This is maintained by Ronnie Bergman in Trondheim. Okay, so you can use this toolbox. I think the ManOpt toolbox is the one that is most accessible. So if you want to test this, it's very easy. You can just download the code, and there are some examples. And yeah, it works quite nicely. Okay, So now I want to impose constraints, as I have already said. So I want to do manifold optimization with constraints, and for that, these constraints need to be smooth, right? Okay, so let's look at some smooth constraints. And this is kind of a cheat that I always do when I want to enforce non-negativity. So there are many algorithms to compute non-negative matrix factorizations. But one way of doing it is by taking a matrix B and squaring all the entries, right? So here this dot or the circle means the entry-wise product or the Hadamard product, right? So if you take a matrix and you square all the entries, then they will be non-negative, of course, right? So I can basically optimize over B, and then this is a smooth function because it's just the square, and I can now find non-negative matrices. So this is my way of doing it, okay? If you now restrict B to be on the oblique manifold, remember the oblique manifold is the manifold that had L2 normalized columns, yeah? So let's go back here, L2 normalized columns. But if I say the columns of B are L2 normalized, then the columns of X will be L1 normalized, okay? And that's actually quite nice because very often L1 normalization, it's not so easy to deal with. It's not smooth and stuff. But if I have non-negativity together with L1 normalization, it's quite nice because I can do this combination here, right? So if you have, especially if you want to do some probability functions, right? Because now L1 normalized means that the column is can be seen as a probabilities, right? The sum of them is 1, and they're all non-negative. So that's what you want, right? So I think this is quite a nice observation here. And then we can also impose non-smooth constraints. So what is a new big thing in Riemannian optimization research is so-called non-smooth Riemannian optimization, which sounds like a contradiction because a Riemannian manifold is a very smooth object, right? You don't really consider anything that has edges or anything, but you can do functions that are non-smooth, like the L1 function, for example, right? You can minimize those also on smooth Riemannian manifolds, and then you have non-smooth Riemannian optimization, and this is a big area of research right now. So all the algorithms that exist for convex optimization or non-smooth optimization are now being generalized on Riemannian manifolds, okay? Okay, so non-smooth optimization on Riemannian manifolds. Okay, so I have about 20 minutes to talk about applications. So are there any questions? So far, this was my basic background. I hope that it was basic enough that you understood. No questions. Okay. Yes?
So, how do you detect something is a manifold? Because rank are matrices. So, I can't intuitively see how can we... For rank R matrices, I cannot intuitively see how can I move from one rank R matrix to another in a smooth fashion.
I mean, it doesn't have to be connected, first of all, right? The manifolds don't have to be connected. They don't have to be closed. Let's say it like this. Has anyone heard of algebraic varieties? Algebraic varieties are 0 sets of polynomials, okay? So if I give you a polynomial, you look at the zeros of the polynomial. Let's say you do this in complex space because then this is a much nicer set. Then this is an algebraic variety. And to see that the matrices of rank R, at most R, so I have given, I don't know, I think I called it M R, but now I want to say M smaller equal R, okay? So these are the matrices that have rank at most R.
Then I can come to 0 and go back to anything.
In your imagination, you mean? Yeah, but I don't think that's, I mean, it's not about that. It's not about if you can go from one point to the other. I don't think that's the main point. The main point is that you show that in each point it has the correct dimension and it doesn't self-intersect and stuff like this, right? So what you do with the algebraic variety or with the set of matrices of ranks at most R, you can look at the determinants of the minors of the matrix, right? You can look at the corresponding minors, then you have determinants. And what are determinants but polynomials, right? So determinants in the end are simply polynomials, so it's very easy to see that this is an algebraic variety because it's a 0 set of polynomials, right? And now it turns out that if you take the smooth part of an algebraic variety, this is always a manifold. Okay, so that's one way of seeing it, yeah? to study algebraic varieties. But otherwise, you have a function. So usually you describe your set by a function, and it should be the zero set of a function. Then you take needs that the Jacobian has correct dimension, and then everything works out. Okay, this is one way of doing it. Yeah, I don't think that your intuition about 2 points always being able to connect, that's not the correct way of looking at it. Because in this case, you could also do that, right? From here to here, but it's not a manifold. It actually is a manifold if you take this point out, but then you can't do this anymore. So, yeah, I don't know. Okay, applications. The first one I wanted to show you is cancer classification, and that's where I use the joint factorizations. So we have M patients, and in this case, in our application, we had 3 different data sets. These were gene expression data. So so maybe I start a little bit earlier than this. What happened is that people had tumor in the eye. Okay, so there are many, many different forms of tumors, and one of them is the uveal melanoma. So it's this form of skin cancer of the skin in the eye. Yeah, it's very rare, but the nice thing about it, or let's say the nice thing mathematically, is that it's very well understood. Okay, so you can take this tumor. People have people take out the tumor cells, and they do measurements on the tumor cells. And one measurement you can do is gene expression data. So you look at all the genes. The human being has around 20,000 different genes, yeah? And you look at the expression in the cells. So how well are these genes expressed? And there is some kind of measurement, but this means like how are these genes active or not, okay? And then you save this for each patient. For each row, you have for each gene an expression number, okay? This expression number is positive. It's usually 0 or close to 0 if there's no expression, and something in the millions if there is some expression. So this is, often you take the logarithm of this, right? But I didn't, so it's a non-negative number, okay? Then we have methylation data. What you do here is, again, you look at the DNA, but what you measure is the basis in the DNA, the cytosine. Right, there's TCGA and the C base. That one can be altered a little bit, which is called a methylation. And if this happens, often this yields cancer. Okay, and you can measure this as well. So we can.
N1 is the all genes.
N1 is all genes. Yeah, 20,000. It's a large matrix. Yeah. Methylation data N2 is also all genes basically. There are, for some reason, it's a different number. I think there are some more genes, but don't ask me. I'm not the one that gave. I didn't come up with a data set, right? It's again non-negative number. Okay, and we have again for each patient, and then we have copy number data. This is this is not a non-negative number, because what this means is that for each gene. No, this is actually not for each gene. This is a bit more complicated. But you again look at the genome, and you see that if it's, so usually you have of each part of the genome, you have 2 parts, right? You have the 2 chromosomes for each chromosome, so everything appears twice. But sometimes due to certain problems, this can change. And you can have duplications or deletions. Deletion means you have only 1, and duplication means you have 3, okay? 3 times the same part of the DNA, basically. And you find some way of storing this in a data set, and you can say, okay, sometimes this is +1, sometimes this is -1. Somehow there are also numbers in between that. So they have some way of measuring that, okay? But this is not non-negative data. This is some regular, it's a matrix that has entries between, let's say, 2 and -2 or something like this, okay? And this is also quite a large matrix. Yeah, so we have these 3 matrices. I call them G, M, and C, okay? Now I want to do the joint factorization. So what I want to do is I minimize these distances here, G minus U V1 transpose, M minus U V2 transpose, C minus U V3 transpose, but the U matrix should be the same in each case, okay? Because the U matrix gives me the expression of the feature vectors. I want to find some feature vectors and how much for each patient are these expressed. So the idea is that for each of these feature vectors, they somehow correspond to each other in the different data sets, okay? So the first feature vector of V1 corresponds to the first feature vector of V2 and to the first feature vector of V3. That's the idea, okay? So the U matrix gives us how much are they given for each patient. Now what I want is that this is a non-negative number, okay? So I want to have a non-negative combination of those. And I want that V1 and V2 are also non-negative because we have non-negative data, right? And then I want that V1, V2, and V3 are also column normalized because feature vectors should be column normalized. Otherwise, they're not so easy to interpret, right? If I get some really large vector, it's not so interesting, or some very small vector. So these are my constraints here. Quite a lot of constraints. This is just a matrix, yeah. Yeah.
So product of one non-negative matrix with another matrix with negative entry can be non-negative. So product of U V1 can be non-negative even though V1 has some negative entries.
Yes, that's true.
So then why are we imposing the condition to make the...
Well, okay, that's a good question. You're saying that basically because we can basically enforce, even if V1 has negative entries, we can enforce that the product of both is still non-negative if U is, yeah. I mean, first of all, it might not work because we have too many restrictions. I mean, I guess it must work because there is a solution also for the non-negative case. But also, the feature vectors should be interpretable in the same domain, right? So if the data is gene expression data, you want that the feature vector contains the same kind of data type, right? So if I get negative numbers in V1 now, what does this mean as an expression? As gene expression, does it mean that the gene is expressed negatively? No, that can't be because we don't have that, right? So you want to interpret the feature vectors afterwards, and that's the reason why you impose the non-negativity constraint on the feature vectors. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So what do we do in order to make sure that this works? Well, we say that U is given by the product of the entry-wise product of a matrix. V1 is given by the entry-wise product of a matrix, and V2 is given by the entry-wise product of a matrix, right? So this means that if I now minimize over Z, W1 and W2, then I get non-negative U, V1 and V2, right? Also, I said now that I want these to be column normalized in L2 norm, yeah? So this means that V3 should be in the oblique manifold. It should have column normalization. And W1 and W2 should be they should be L4 normalized because the square should be L2 normalized, right? That's my idea. So this again gives me a manifold, the oblique 4 manifold. I mean, this is something that I came up with basically, but it's a manifold. And now we can. So what do we do now? We minimize this whole function over Z, W1, W2, and V3. We have 4 factors, right? And then we get the result, okay? So we did this, and then we took the matrix U, which is kind of the matrix that corresponds to each data set. So we kind of merged all the data sets in the matrix U. And now I did principal component analysis, or I just did principal components, and I looked at the first 3 principal components of U. And these are given here. So for each patient, I have a point in 3-dimensional space. And then I colored them according to known clusterings that are known from biology, okay? So people have already looked at this cancer, and as I said, it's quite a well understood cancer. And you can see here that especially the blue parts and the green and yellow parts are very well separated from each other. This corresponds to, there are basically 2 subgroups of this cancer. One is like about half of the people get metastasis afterwards, so this metastasizes in the body, and the other half do not get this, okay? And you can apparently see this from the data set. And I can't remember which one's which, but you can see the distinction here. And then the biologists have also identified 2 subclasses of that. Well, you can see the separation quite well as well, right? So this worked relatively well, okay? This is the idea here. We do some unsupervised learning. If I wanted to now, I could do k-means and I could find out my own clusterings, right? This is the idea. Any questions? Okay, since I have 10 minutes left, I think I will skip the next application and we'll go to the signal processing application because we are in the Institute of Signal Processing, I guess. And maybe it's going to be interesting for you. And we can go back to this one if you're still interested and we have time. So, sorry, no, I'm already here. Okay, low rank and row sparse recovery, okay? So this is my, my application. What we want is we aim to recover a low rank and row sparse signal x from m measurements. Okay, we have a signal x, that's a matrix, and we have that many of the rows of x are 0. Okay, just the entire row is 0. That's the signal. And I also know that the signal is low rank, so I can decompose it into very low rank matrix. I will get to why we do this. And then we have m measurements. So we have some measurement operator a here. So we have a is some measurement operator we take of x, and then we have the outputs that we can that we can measure, the y's. And now we want to basically minimize this. We know the measurement operator, we know the signal or the receiving output, but we want to get x back, right? The signal, right? We want to recover the signal. Okay, so what do? We minimize this function ax minus y for x. We know y and a, right? We restrict that x is a low rank matrix. So here this means that it has rank r. Yeah. And then we say that x should also minimize, or we also want to minimize this 1-2 norm here. So this means that you basically take the sum of the L2 norms of the rows. Okay? So this is the measurement operator here, a, that measures m times. Then we have these measurements y. We have the rank R manifold. We have a penalty parameter, and we have this 1-2 norm, which means that we basically take the sum of the or the L1 norm of the row norms, of the L2 row norms. Okay, why is this related to signal processing? Well, it comes from the idea of blind deconvolution. What you have here is you basically, I mean, I'm not an expert, but you send out a signal, and the signal is sparse, so only a few frequencies are occupied. And then the signal is convoluted, so what happens is somehow it bounces off buildings and so on, and you receive measurements at the end. It's convoluted by these bounces, and you receive several measurements. And the convolution in Fourier, so if you look at the Fourier domain, the convolution is a rank 1 product in the end, okay? So this means that you have a sparse vector convoluted with a dense vector, but in Fourier domain, this means you have a sparse vector in a rank 1 product or in an outer product with a dense vector, and this means that x is rank 1 and row sparse. Okay, that's the idea. That's where it comes from. So now we want to solve this problem, and this is in blind deconvolution, this low rank and row sparse recovery is quite well known, and people look at it a lot. Usually people, what people do is they do convex optimization here, so they minimize this norm and the nuclear norm, and then take this as a side constraint. But the downside of the whole thing is what is the problem right now is that you want to have as few measurements as possible, right? And the problem is if you do convex optimization here, you need either as many measurements as there are sparse entries, or as many measurements as there are low rank entries. The degrees of freedom are either from sparsity or from low rank. But somehow you have combined both. So you expect that you need fewer measurements because you know that it's sparse and low rank. And somehow this cannot be seen by convex optimization, right? So my idea is what we want to do it using Riemannian optimization with the matrix manifold here, okay? So one idea is the Riemannian iterative hard thresholding algorithm. What you do is basically you do Riemannian gradient step of this function on the, so in this case we only look at this function, we drop the part behind. We perform a Riemannian gradient step on the matrices of low rank on this manifold. And then you truncate the rows where the norm is too small. Okay, so this is just truncate, you throw them away. So the upside of this is fast. The downside is we need to know how many rows we have to throw away, right? This is the problem always of hard thresholding algorithms. So this is one algorithm that we have shown that it works. But one thing that I have shown in the paper that is here is that, or what we have done is then we have looked at the proximal gradient algorithm. Okay, and this is a Riemannian version of the proximal gradient, which is non-smooth optimization. You might know this, right? So here we basically do a Riemannian gradient step, and then we do the proximal gradient, the prox step of the 1-2 norm. Okay, And the nice thing about this is that the Riemannian gradient step here is we can compute this quite easily. But the prox step, the nice thing is that on the low rank manifold, we have to compute this proximal map. But on the low rank manifold, this is actually known how to do that. We can find that this means that the prox step here is just the soft thresholding of the rows. Okay, so it's quite nice that you can show this, and then using this together, we can somehow perform this algorithm, right? And for this, the sparsity can be unknown, but so far the algorithm is relatively slow. Okay, and this is from a paper that we did a while ago. So here you can see that if we do Riemannian adaptive iterative hard thresholding, we are relatively fast. Few iterations. If we do this proximal gradient, we need a lot of iterations, and it's pretty slow, right? So this is the downside. But we have now come up with a new version of the Riemannian proximal gradient where we have also convergence guarantees, and you basically recover all of the convergence guarantees that you get in Euclidean case. So you get this 1 over square root convergence, right? So it's not linear convergence, but sublinear convergence that you get on Riemannian manifolds. And we can even show this on non-convex Riemannian manifolds, okay? So they don't have to be convex. So a lot of the things work out quite well. Yeah, I think since there should be a little bit of time for questions, I think I will stop here. So the last application I will skip, and then thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for delivering an interesting talk. So in the interest of time, we will take one question and conclude.
So in your medical application, like you have some of Frobenius norms.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think that, okay, this is a good factorization, like you have norm of U transpose V, J minus U U V1 transpose. So why do you think this is a good optimization, and why you think, okay, if you solve this, the objective will be minimized and like will be best compared to other factorization? Why do you not to compare other factorization? So what's the logic behind choosing objective like in this form?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So this is obviously a modeling question, right? So how do you model your data? I wanted to basically come up with something that is very similar to PCA, because I wanted to have feature extraction, right? I wanted to interpret the features. I wanted to do clustering on the U matrix, right? So it made sense to me that this U matrix is non-negative, has non-negative entries, and so on. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the correct format, right? This is just one way of doing it. It worked for our application. For many applications, it might not work, because clearly, I mean, one of the things that I'm assuming here is that there are some linear dependencies. This is what you always assume in these kind of matrix factorizations, right? If there would be quadratic or anything else dependencies, you wouldn't catch that. Of course, that's something, yeah. So the idea is we can somehow do dimensionality reduction in a similar way that PCA does it, except that we do it for several data sets. And it turned out that the more you constrain, or like these constraints work quite well. So I also tested, for example, orthogonality constraints for the features. That would make sense, right? But then it was too restrictive, and it didn't really get out the good results and so on. I mean, clearly, this is. I guess we're moving into into the domain of modeling, where you have to ask yourself these questions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess some of you are still having questions. If so, please connect with the speaker while having refreshments at our coffee hut. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.